Let's chat.
So, Professor Rojas, in your research, you said that people who receive news from online media tend to perceive that the society is more polarized than people who receive news from the traditional media. Could you explain to us why is that?
Okay, well, yes, as you're pointing out, in 10 studies that we've done in different countries, we find that pattern in which internet news leads you to believe that you're in a more polarized society. So one of the points I was making during my presentation is, in most countries, being exposed to media doesn't make you more polarized, but it makes you think that your country is more polarized. The explanation that we have thought about for this phenomena is that it relates to how news are distributed in the new media environment. So it used to be that you would subscribe to a newspaper and you would read the information from that newspaper, or you would watch a television show, the newscast that you liked, and you would watch the entirety of that newscast. Nowadays, we start to get more and more information from our friends. And so I'm from a generation that I still have the habit of, in the morning, I sit down, I take my iPad and I read the newspaper, the traditional newspaper, but it's online version. But increasingly, more and more of my students tell me things like, I don't need to read the newspaper because when something happens, I found out via Facebook. And what this means ultimately is that most of the information is now being distributed to us by our social networks. And so we think that in that process of that change of a direct relationship to the media outlet, to have this new actor, which is my friends, my social network, I think what starts happening is that my friends tend to forward to me news that contains extreme examples of things. And so probably if we're in a country, let's say, where there's some liberal versus conservative divide, and I am a liberal, many of my friends will also be liberal, and they will only probably send me conservative news when it's very, very radical points of view. That's when they send it to me. And so I start to think that all conservatives are that radical, or vice versa. If I were a conservative, then, when in reality, there are many conservatives that have many more moderate positions, but because of the new distribution system, I don't see those. I only see the extremely radical ones on all sides. And so we think that's what explains this phenomena of an increased perception of polarization.
And how would you suggest our society deal with that kind of phenomenon?
Well, it's complicated because those are our social networks, and our society is not going to change our social networks. We make those relationships. It's people that we have friended over our whole lives. It's co-workers. And so in a way, those are kind of a given. Of course, we make decisions about who is our friend and who is not our friend. But once we've made that decision, this person starts to be part of our social network. Now, what I think then, as journalists, we need to be aware of those new distribution mechanisms. And we have to be aware of how what we're saying is going to be perceived by people that do not share our beliefs. And I think if in that process, we end up, well, number one, doing better journalism, and number two, potentially moderating these perceptions of polarization. I'll give you an example of this. In my Facebook account, I have 600 contacts. Some of these are people I went to high school with. Others I've met during the course of my life. And many of these think differently than I do, support issues that I do not support. But they're my friends. I know them. I don't want to finish the relationship with them. And so what happens to me is that if I'm going to post something on Facebook, I think a lot about it, because I want it to be a statement that I'm happy, comfortable with friends who will not agree with it and friends who will agree with it. And so I think that through this added layer of reflexivity, if I think more about what I'm going to say, I'm probably able to convey a more centered message. And I think in that same fashion, journalists need to think about, well, not only how well did I craft this product, this news, but how is it going to be interpreted by my audience? And thinking about how the audience interprets it might make it into more balanced, better journalism.
But I believe that in your presentation, when you say that the analyzed content in the media, they are not as polarized as people have conceived, So, right? So
yes,
maybe they are not really that.
That's one of the things that we found is that it's most people when they're listening or watching or reading newspapers, tend to focus more on the parts of the argument that does not support their view. And they tend to start thinking, oh, this whole newspaper or this journalist or this chain is against my views. When in reality, the journalist might be providing 2 or 3 arguments that support your view and 2 or 3 arguments that do not support your view. And so we tend to focus more on the arguments that do not support our views. Now, we might say, well, that's part of psychological defense mechanism, but it's something that journalists need to take into account. And that is, we don't know enough, and this is an area of research that interests me now, and I'm trying to develop, which is, okay, so if people tend to perceive journalists as biased against them, even if it's not, so how can we combat this? How can we reduce these perceptions of hostility? And the answer is, we don't know yet.
Yeah, because I think I remember you said in the presentation that the media people are not really doing a bad job. That they're doing quite okay. But it's mainly the perception of the people.
So I'll say it this way. Of course, there's differing media standards in the world. There are media systems that are more solid than others. But I tend to think that people in any country think their media is worse than it actually is.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's true. And you also mentioned a bit about media literacy. If people are told about how media operate, their perception might change. They might not see the society as polarized.
Well, this goes back to a study I did with some colleagues at Wisconsin, in which we said, okay, so could it be that part of the problem is that citizens sometimes may not understand what's the job of a reporter? And so we actually created what's called a news literacy, sort of teaching people about news in the same fashion in which we teach reporters and students about journalism. But this was sort of a compressed version in which basically we were telling to people, look, a good reporter should go out and find points of view that support your argument. But they should also go and find points of view that oppose your argument. And they should present to you all sides of the story. You shouldn't complain because a journalist is presenting all sides of a story. If they're only presenting one side of a story, then you might say, well, this is not good journalism. But you shouldn't also be surprised that they present you the other side. That's their role. And what we found was that as people understood better the role of the journalist, they tended to trust more the work of the journalist and not to react with such hostility towards the work of the journalist.
Yeah. And in Thai society here, to bring into the context of the Thai society, I also have observation between whether media cause the polarization in the society, or actually the polarization is already there. The media just reflect the conflict into society, and it might, in certain state, contribute to the intensify of that polarization. What do you think about that?
That's a good observation. I mean, the first thing I have to be clear is I have not studied this phenomenon in Thailand, and so everything that I say, I preface it by this. I wouldn't be surprised that people overestimate the amount of polarization that is currently happening in Thailand. And so I'm not saying there is no polarization, but I'm saying that people might think that there is more polarization than there really is, because we've seen this in other countries, and I would suspect that it might be the same in Thailand. Now, you're absolutely right in pointing out that if a society is profoundly divided, this will also sort of reflect on media. However, having said that, if you're a good reporter, in a society that's profoundly divided, your role is to bring these people to the table, bring these ideas to the table. And so rather than contributing to a polarization by just focusing on one side of the issue, by bringing multiple sides of the issue, you might teach people about how these points of view may fit together. So I think you're right in terms of it's not that there would be just one cause for polarization, right? So there can be ethnic divides, there can be religious divides that result in polarization. Now, media then has a role to play. It can enhance that or it can reduce it. I think the role of a journalist is to reduce that polarization, not to enhance it.
Do you start to see that trend that media start to help reduce the polarization in the society?
I have not seen that trend. What I see in the countries that I've studied is that it does not enlarge polarization. So being an habitual consumer of news does not make you more polarized. But it doesn't make you less polarized, which is what I would wish for. So I think we need that next step of not only, it's good that it doesn't enhance polarization, but it should actually decrease polarization. Right now it seems to be just keeping things as they are.
Since you teach journalism, do you expect your students, when they start their career, would they do the job of helping reducing the conflict in society?
I truly hope so. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Rojas, for joining IRNBIS today. You might be in the US, but we hope that we will have you, to join our program in the near future. ขอบคุณมากนะครับ
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
I hope you find my interview with Associate Professor Rojas interesting and learn something from our program today. IRNBIS is broadcast every Saturday from 11 to 11:30 p.m. Thanks for spending your time with us. Hope to see you again next week.